So welcome everyone to this podcast. I'm Ryan, an Agile coach and Scrum Master, and today I'm joined by three of my colleagues, Matt, John, and Paul. Welcome, gents.
Hello.
So the topic of discussion today, we actually have a companion blog that's available to you all to read called Ain't Nobody Got Time for That. Really what we're focusing on today is meetings. What makes a good one? With a slight slant on Scrum events, as that's kind of all of our background. So I'm just going to pass to each of the three of my wonderful colleagues just to give a brief introduction to who they are before we jump into the topic. So Matt, over to you. Who are you?
I'm Matt. I'm a full-time Scrum Master, occasional product owner, and sometimes coach.
Fantastic. So a bit of a jack of all trades.
Yeah, a little bit.
Fantastic. Paul, over to you.
Hi, Paul, and a full-time product owner. Have worked as a Scrum Master, and I'm what you might call a reformed project manager.
We can't reform them all though, right? And John.
Hi, I'm John, full-time Scrum Master, and general great person.
Oh, if you say so yourself.
Yeah, well, no one else is, so I have to put it out there.
We all think it, John. We all think it. So thank you for you all for joining, and also thank you for the people listening. So the topic, like I said, we're focusing on is what makes a good meeting. And I guess the first question to the panelists is, what makes a good meeting to you? So Matt, perhaps you'd like to start.
Yeah, I guess I was thinking about this as terms of I think it's slightly different between general meetings and Scrum stuff, in that I think the outcome of a normal meeting, you're looking for some sort of an agreement or actions for individuals. And I think personally, when I'm doing Scrum stuff, Scrum ceremonies, whatever you want to call them, I think I'm probably looking to try and generate some good conflict with the team, so that we can get ideas and bounce stuff around and get a general understanding of a problem rather than necessarily a specific action for an individual. But I think for both, at the end of it, you're looking for a way forward, right? That's what any meeting should be about.
That's right. You want some clear actions to take away. Otherwise, to a certain extent, was it a waste of time? I like your comment about getting some conflict, right? Healthy conflict is really useful. There's a really interesting thing called the not five stages of dysfunction, but also the conflict volcano. And you obviously don't want it to get to a head and explode. But yeah, conflict can be really helpful. Paul, what about for you? What makes a good meeting?
I think it really needs to be fully inclusive. If there's people that can't or won't speak up in the meeting, you have to have a serious think about why not. Was it a technical problem? Do you need to change the platform for the virtual meeting or the physical meeting? Do you need to change the environment? Or is there something else going on? Why did they feel like they couldn't contribute? And it's fine if people don't want to speak up in the meeting. If they want to talk in the chat, in the text chat down the side, that's fine as well. You should be able to. Most people can cope with those two channels. But if somebody's not contributing at all, yeah, you have to go away and have a bit of a serious think to what's going on there.
Does it matter then if everyone doesn't contribute? Is it a waste of their time?
I'd say not, personally. I think one of the things for me about meeting is making sure that the people that kind of need to be involved or need the information are there, because sometimes you'll go to a meeting and it's not necessarily something for you to kind of pitch into or give your viewpoints on, but sometimes actually just going to something and finding some information out then helps further down the line. So I wouldn't necessarily say everyone has to always input into a meeting. I think Paul probably right in saying, okay, is there a reason why someone wasn't saying anything, to see if there's anything an issue in that point. But I wouldn't necessarily say everyone has to say something at a meeting for it to be successful.
Yeah, I think a large part of that, I sort of agree with Paul in that I think but I think maybe it's more about making sure that everyone is able to contribute, or that the people there are the right people, like John says. I think a lot of the time you'll get personalities in meetings that don't feel so comfortable in speaking up, but as long as they've got the option and maybe they feel comfortable to text chat during time if it's a virtual meeting, or take time afterwards to talk to people about stuff. I think for me it's about knowledge making sure that everyone understands a problem.
Yeah, there's probably a scale, isn't there? If there's hardly anyone contributing except the person chairing it or facilitating, then that meeting probably could have been an email. If you've got some people contributing but not everyone, then you have to have a think about what's going on there. Have you got that level of psychological safety for people to speak up and not be afraid of speaking up and sharing their thoughts, or just asking questions to clarify?
I think that's interesting, isn't it? Because actually meetings kind of have different purposes. A meeting to me is something where you're trying to gain consensus on a decision, and therefore actually it's a zero hierarchy. As soon as you start to go more towards a one-sided thing, is that a meeting or is that an email? If you want one person to just explain something, you probably don't need everyone in the same room. And actually sometimes by having it in a meeting format, if you just want to give a one-way set of information, can actually confuse the issue more. How do you guys think we do it within our authority? Do you think we do meetings well or not so well?
Difficult. I think it very much depends on the meeting and who's there, to be honest. I sort of feel like it's got better, to be honest, since COVID and we've done virtual stuff. I think there used to be a lot of meetings for the sake of meetings. You'd get an invite on an email and you'd feel obliged to go regardless, because it was in an office down the road. But I think it seems a bit better now. There are problems around that as well, which I think maybe we'll get onto later if we start talking about the benefits of virtual stuff. But yeah, I don't think there's one answer for that, to be honest, Brian. I think it very much depends. If I work with one team, they might do meetings really well. If I move to another one, it might be chaos.
Yeah, all depends on the people, right? We talk actually in the blog about kind of a 4-stage good meeting, perhaps the BEEF approach, which is the boundaries, execution, actions, and finish. And it's something that I personally use. So whenever I get into a meeting, if I'm particularly facilitating it, define the boundaries, the box that we're trying to live within. It makes it clear to people and it kind of tries to avoid those tangents. Then when you go on to the execution, really clean and crisp. It doesn't necessarily always mean having an agenda, but someone trying very much actually like I'm doing now as a facilitator, as a panelist, I can get involved, but also ensure that the conversation is moving towards a valuable place. And then we have actions. I think something that you mentioned earlier, Matt, a good meeting is something where you leave knowing the next step. We've all been in meetings sometimes where we go, what were we trying to achieve there? Did we get what we wanted? Oh no, if not, let's just create another meeting. And then the final step of that BEEF approach is finishing on time. A lot of people just book a 1-hour calendar slot and it fills up your calendar. Sometimes 20 minutes is enough. Do you agree, gents?
Absolutely. I like that BEEF approach. Definitely try. There's something that I try to bear in mind. I probably don't do it as often as I should, but it's the SPICE method of persuasion is worth looking into. We'll try and add a link in later, but the acronym SPICE is a way of thinking about how to persuade people of something, but I use it also in meetings to try and make the meeting more interesting, more humane, and even more fun. And it stands for simple, making sure in advance that the purpose of the meeting is clear, simple, and understood by everyone. The P stands for perceived self-interest. So just have a thought about who's invited to the meeting and what are they likely to want to get out of this. The I stands for incongruous, meaning something unusual, different, or funny about it. And we've seen during lockdown that we started off, most of our retros were at first were a bit stilted, pretty much the same. What do we stop, start, or continue? But as we've got better at it, our retros have become much more imaginative. We're sharing templates with other teams as well, and it's getting better and better. And some of the retros are now really imaginative, using crazy templates to really make it feel so much fun that you forget it's work sometimes. It's some of them are that good. Where did I get to? C, with confidence. So yeah, with a bit of preparation, confidence will come more naturally. But yeah, you can persuade anyone of anything with confidence. And yeah, trying to create the environment of psychological safety that we were talking about there, where people can ask questions, clarify what people mean, and then contribute with some confidence. And finally, empathy, considering other people's situation. So if they don't want to have their camera turned on today, that's fine. If there's something going on in the background they don't want to share with you, then that's absolutely fine. Just having a bit of thought and kindness for others in the call.
So we've talked a bit generically about good meetings. Obviously, our background, a lot of it is leveraging the Scrum framework. So for those listening who maybe haven't come across Scrum, Scrum is an empirical-based product development framework, particularly for complex products. And it has 5 events. It has an initial kickoff, which is called the sprint planning event. We then have a daily Scrum, which every day we iterate with 15 minutes on the people doing the work to try and move us forward. We then have a sprint review at the end where we get our stakeholders to look at the increment we've produced, and then a sprint retrospective where the team doing the work get together and try and identify how they can improve. All of that's wrapped up in the 5th event called the sprint. So we've talked about what makes a good meeting. What makes a good Scrum event? Is it the same? Is it different? John, what do you think?
Oh, that's a hard one. I think personally with Scrum and the events, there's a little bit more clear understanding of the purpose of the event. So that instantly helps you in facilitator role as Scrum Master and what you're trying to get out of it. So kind of ad hoc meetings where you're trying to bring people together to answer questions or something like that. Sometimes it's a lot easier to let those drift and have it somewhat unclear of where you want to get out of it. I think within Scrum, that's one of the reasons why it's such a powerful framework, in that the events that are there are, you know, they're there for certain things and they're there purely for those mechanisms. They're not there to try to go off piste about talking about different things. And then as a Scrum Master, you know, if things go off a tangent, it's a bit easier to go, hang on a moment, that's valid, but it's not what we're looking to do today. So I think that's why there's probably such a powerful tool, and you know, especially in a kind of development engineering way, it's a good, you know, it's one of the things that we're looking to drive more within the organization.
It's a really good point, actually, that sometimes the Scrum events make things purposeful. I've certainly worked with developers who think, you know, perhaps that meetings are not as valuable. They want to just be creating the features, writing the tests, because that's where the value is perceived. But actually having these purposeful events that are time boxed to a maximum, right? This is our purpose. This is the goal, right? This is the outcomes. People understand it. We create transparency immediately. Matt, what do you think about that? How are your Scrum events?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think it's for me, it's a lot of, one of the reasons I got into doing Agile and Scrum in the first place is because I got so frustrated with just doing stuff for the sake of it. I spent a long time doing testing and test management, and the last couple of contracts I had before I started doing stuff here, I think I spent 6 months writing test strategies for things that had already been done, just to tick a box, and I hated it. And I think with Scrum, the main thing for me is that by breaking it up into those increments, regardless of which event you're talking about, there's a purpose that you're just looking at a goal for the next 2 or 3 weeks. You're trying to do the most valuable thing first, not focusing on stuff that's 6 months, a year down the line that you might not ever end up working on. So I think, yeah, for me, it's about making sure that all of the events maintain that focus and you're just concentrating on the most useful stuff to do right away.
I like the way that Scrum events and meetings try to break the paradox, because the daily Scrum, sometimes in a team they'll be reluctant to join because they complain that it just goes on too long and it's not very useful. So by tightening it up and trying to stick to 15 minutes and get to a nice snappy format, it's more likely that people will join, and it's less intrusive on getting back to work and getting back to coding. And it becomes more effective. But it's quite hard sometimes in teams to break that cycle of people just droning on for half an hour. But if you can break that cycle, it's well worthwhile, because it then becomes a really short, sharp, useful sharing of knowledge of what's going on.
That's a really good point that you make, that I think sometimes a lot of developers feel like meetings and the Scrum events break up their work, and that they perhaps don't consider that to be valuable and not their work. One of the topics that I guess we wanted to discuss was about self-managing teams. That's something that Scrum really pushes hard for, that the teams, and I want to clarify here that we often use the term development team. That actually got removed from Scrum last year. We have a Scrum team, a product owner, a Scrum master, and a collection of developers are the 3 accountabilities. Together, They are the ones that self-manage. So we talk a lot about facilitation and meetings and their purpose. Whose accountability is it to make sure our events are purposeful? What do we think? Is it the Scrum Master? Is it everyone?
It's everyone, isn't it? It's the whole team. That's part. I think you touched earlier on about psychological safety and trust as well. I think that's a big part of it, in that, especially with daily stand-ups, it's making sure that everyone knows what's going on and everyone shares problems so that they can collectively be accountable for fixing them. So it's those sort of collaborative events that help the team become self-managing, by making sure that everyone's working closely together and, you know, not drifting off just to come back at the end of the sprint.
John, have you maybe experienced that in the past, where teams kind of get together at the start, see you in 3 weeks, folks?
Yeah, I think it depends on the maturity and the understanding, I think, more than anything else, of what, you know, what the purpose of the different events are driving it. I guess that's what one of the biggest things is, as the Scrum Master role, in actually trying to explain and educate everyone involved what, you know, the reasoning behind the different events. As you say, it should be ideally everyone's responsibility within the Scrum team to, you know, understand and make the best of everything within the framework. I guess it's the Scrum Master's responsibility to keep that in check, I guess, and understand if that's not being the case, and trying to ask the questions and educate people as best they can to know, well, you know, you might not share these viewpoints. Why are those? Why is that? And to be able to kind of, you know, hear those valid, because it's a framework, right? It's not a religion or a kind of something, a mantra that is 100% and is static and is always one way, and every team works differently. And sometimes there will be some things that purely don't make sense, but it's being able to get those questions and those conversations out of the team to understand what it is that you can change. And obviously the retrospective is a great way to kind of use that as a tool base, and as a Scrum Master, you're there, I guess, to see if you can see those pockets of issues that maybe people won't see or don't want to talk about, and try to bring them to the air, and then get everybody involved in finding out what everybody else thinks.
That's really, really good points. Can I? Some of the best Scrum Masters I've seen recognize two things that happen in teams. First of all, there's a lot more neurodiversity in teams than we usually realize at first. And they are also familiar with, even if they don't know the word for it, they know about this concept of pluralistic ignorance, which is the problem where everybody assumes that everyone else knows something, so they're too afraid to speak up and ask because they don't want to be the only one that asks. And what the really great Scrum Masters do is they ask the dumb questions. They say things like, oh, what do we generally do when somebody leaves the team, or when it's somebody's birthday, or why do we ritually do this kind of thing on a Friday? And by asking those questions, it makes it safe for others to ask, but it also shares the knowledge of the culture within the team of why do we do stuff like that. And for some people, particularly in neurodiverse teams, it makes people feel so much more comfortable, because there's all these strange rituals that go on and nobody's ever talked about them or explained why we do it like that. And the Scrum Master, great Scrum Masters, can really help the team feel much more comfortable and productive and involved by asking those kinds of questions.
Stupid questions are a speciality of mine, Paul.
Oh yeah. No, you call them powerful questions as a Scrum Master, right? I think that's a really good point, right? A Scrum Master is there to coach and guide. It's not a manager. And I think that's something that's perhaps sometimes misunderstood by teams. And sometimes, because I know personally, you can sometimes feel almost like a snake oil salesman, that you're doing a role that you believe to be correct, but people are expecting something different from you. They expect you to run the meetings, to run the Scrum events, and if a decision is not being made, to make the decision. That's not really it. I mean, Scrum is a framework, like John said. It is a rule book and a set of boundaries that we guide people on, but we don't say this is the one true way. You have to do it this way. If we need to inspect and adapt, let's be empirical about it. So I guess to wrap up where we are, just halfway through our podcast, roughly, we've said that actually a really great meeting and a great Scrum event has a fixed time, a time box, because it promotes focus, something that Matt had spoken about. We also spoke about the SPICE method, about creating that psychological safety and also empathy within meetings and asking stupid questions so that people can feel like they're contributing and ask questions if they need to. We also spoke about the BEEF method, creating boundaries and then executing well, creating clear actions, and also finishing promptly. Where we're going to next is really the idea of Elon Musk. So we spoke a bit in the blog about Elon's guidance for great teams at Tesla. And he has a few, right? He says things about stopping big meetings, leave meetings if you're not contributing, ignore hierarchy, communicate directly, and my favorite, follow logic, not rules. But the one I want to pick up there is about leaving a meeting if you're not contributing. Have you ever done that? Open floor.
It's difficult though, right? I mean, I can totally see Elon Musk just walking out of a meeting without saying anything. I think it's probably a little bit more difficult for the rest of us to do that. I know I've gone into meetings before at the beginning and said, I'm not sure if I can contribute much. If I'm not, I've got some other stuff to do and I'll wander off. But it is difficult. I don't know if it's more or less difficult on virtual meetings. I guess it depends if your camera's on and if people can see you just wandering off. But it's
is that what network issues means when people drop off?
Yeah, exactly. Breaking up.
Yeah.
I'm not sure. I agree with the sentiment, but I think it's maybe a little bit more difficult to do than it is to say.
I agree.
There's leaving the meeting if it's not useful to you is actually one of the principles of an unconference or an open space event. They used to call it the rule of 2 feet, but that's not entirely an accessible comment. So they call it move to where you can make a difference as a rule for the event, which is quite good, and that works really well. And it's just a general understanding that no one will take offense if you leave the meeting. Just you can state it in advance or have it as one of your sort of team culture principles. But yeah, move to where you can make a difference is very powerful. I also have seen, maybe not such a great example, but it worked. I knew a consultant in a different department who had just a personal policy that the department were paying him a lot of money to add value. If you invited him to a meeting and he wasn't involved in any way in the first 10 minutes, he'd just walk out. And people quickly learned that if you're going to invite this guy to the meeting, it better blooming well involve him or be of relevance to him in some way. Otherwise, it was pretty obvious that it was just a meeting for the sake of a meeting.
I think taking money out of it is also about respect. If I'm inviting you three to a meeting, it's because I want your input. I mean, I guess the other side of this is that if a meeting is at a point where you feel like you need to leave, challenge and say, folks, can I help? Is there something that we're missing? Are we off tangent? But if we're talking about Scrum events, in the retrospective, it's an opportunity to reflect and improve. If we had a daily Scrum and it was rubbish, we've all been there. How can we make it better? Let's have that. That's not even a stupid question, but let's have that question. How could we make this better? There's a really great liberating structure called a 15% solution. As long as you keep making small incremental improvements, over a year they compound. And that's a really great takeaway for meetings. We just need to continue to get them better. As soon as they become formulaic, and if you're feeling they're boring, someone else is probably too. Perhaps we could talk about how we know when a meeting or a Scrum event is good, avoiding the obvious of it just feels like it. John, what do you think? How do you know when either you facilitated or you've been in a good meeting?
Oh, that is a great question. I would say that when you've come out of it, you've actually felt like you've moved forward with something. Would always be. I've been in lots of meetings that are good, lots of meetings that are bad, and I generally tend to find that when I've come out of it, I was going into that meeting knowing something, or not knowing something, I should say, and I came out knowing something that I wanted to know. So yeah, I mean, having a clear objective to the meeting, going into it as an individual, because people go into meetings for different purposes, right? Because sometimes you might be for the sprint review, an example, you might be stakeholder. So you're going in there for a different reason than, say, a product owner, or a different reason from a development team. So understanding what you are as an individual looking to get out of the meeting. And yeah, I guess if you're not getting those answers, that's the bit where, yeah, you challenge rather than walk out, I'd say.
A bit like Ryan said earlier on, if you come out of an event or a meeting thinking you need another event or meeting, then it's probably gone wrong, right?
Yeah. One thing I used to do when I used to send calendar invites is the calendar invite, whereas we sometimes just send a slot with a description. I had 3 things. I said purpose, basically question we're trying to answer, attendees, and then, you know, definite ones and optional attendees. And then basically a very brief, almost unconference-like agenda. We're going to start off by talking here, see where we go, but these are our expected actions. Again, providing those boundaries, I think, help people. It certainly helps me if I'm going to a meeting to know what they want of me.
Yeah, so I mean, talking about Scrum events and that, I think I definitely try and do that when I start with new teams. I think I probably fall into the same rut as a lot of Scrum Masters, in that I stopped doing that after working with teams for a while. I kind of think that they know what's going on now. But definitely early doors, I always try and make sure everyone understands the exact reason why we're doing each ceremony.
So going back to the question then about metrics, how do we know when a meeting's been good? Do we have any ideas?
I'd like to hear them.
I struggle with this. I do. I'll be honest.
Okay.
Paul, you love your metrics.
Oh yeah. All product owners love a good graph, don't they? I've seen, this may not be the best measure, but successful meeting series, if it's your daily Scrum or any other series of meetings, you could keep an eye on the attendance. If it stays the same or grows, then people probably feel like they're getting something out of it. If the attendance is shrinking, you might want to have a think about why. That's not the ideal measure. There's something else about, you said don't say because it felt like it when you're talking about whether a meeting felt good. But if you analyze that a little bit, if you come out of a meeting feeling relaxed, calm, happy, is probably because you're now a bit more, you've got a better situational awareness of what's going on around you and why, and you had some of your questions answered and you were able to contribute. If you come out of a meeting feeling frustrated, annoyed, or anything else, your natural tendency is to book another meeting because you didn't scratch that itch or get the answer you were looking for, or get any more aware of what's going on and why. So yeah, if you feel the urgency to book another meeting after the meeting, then that's definitely a sign that it was bad.
You just reminded me of something actually, Paul. I've done a few courses, like coaching courses and stuff before, where the trainers at the end, they'll ask for like a couple of words to describe how a particular event went, and I think that works a lot better than trying to score a meeting. I think even if only half the people write down a couple of words about how they thought it went, that's a more powerful tool to analyze it with afterwards. If you get lots of boring, for example, then you know it's gone wrong, right?
That's actually a really great teaching thing people do. Every child writes on a post-it a word that they feel about the lesson and maybe a key word that they took away from it, hand that into the teacher. I mean, it's not a great analogy for hierarchy, but those kind of metrics matter. Even sometimes like thumbs up, thumbs down. Did we achieve the agenda, the purpose of this meeting? Thumbs up, thumbs down. Sometimes I know scoring isn't ideal, but having some quantitative measures can help.
Yeah.
Do you look to do that on everything, or is that just as a kind of agile coach going into something and seeing, well, maybe we're losing our way a little bit, now's the time to do it? Or is it one that you say every meeting you do it? Because I guess the thing with repeatability is people just lose the understanding of the purpose of it.
I guess for me, like Matt said, when you start with new teams, it's important to look at Scrum events. Did this sprint planning work for you? Yes or no? And you're right, but after a while, that's just an initial indicator for the Scrum Master to know where to focus. After a while, and you understand the teams and the emotions, and hopefully you start getting some transparency where you don't just need a thumbs up, thumbs down. People will be like, you know what, Ryan, that was shocking. And sometimes that's what you need. Even just small interactions, pulling someone aside after the meeting, Paul, did that work for you? It didn't really work for me. So to answer your question, John, when do I use it? I mean, it's obviously biased towards me whenever I felt like it maybe didn't go as well as I hoped.
I had one team that had there was just a metal cabinet near where they normally got together for the daily scrum, and they each had a little magnetic token with a printout of their avatar on it, so you could see who was who. And at the end of every daily scrum, the scrum master would ask a question, and people would, as they walked out, would just put their magnetic token on a scale to show how they felt, or what their response was to the question. And it was usually, are we getting better? Was that daily scrum more effective than yesterday? That was the usual question, but sometimes you could put other questions in there as well to get a real feel for how people were getting on.
I love that. I love that idea.
I think that goes back to that discussion about safety in teams and trust as well, though, doesn't it? Because you've got to build that and make sure everyone's comfortable with that sort of thing before you can rely on people, really around saying how happy they are. So you've got to have something to base it on.
There's a great expression to remember here, I think, which I don't know where I got it from, but I've seen somewhere the expression, value your dissenters, for at least they still care. Watch out for your sycophants. So if you have someone, when you ask for feedback, if somebody is giving you negative feedback, value it, because they still care enough to give you that feedback. Don't just think, oh, it's just him being an idiot. He's always a pain in the neck. It's valuable feedback, and you have to consider, why are they always on the negative side?
I love that. I absolutely love that. Value your dissenters. Beware of your sycophants. Yeah. There you go, everybody. That's a key takeaway. If people are only ever giving you positive feedback, you're either amazing or someone just loves you. So I guess kind of trying to wrap this up a little bit then, how do we feel meetings and maybe Scrum events specifically have been impacted by going virtually? This is, I guess, something that's happened particularly over the last 12, 18 months and for X period in the future. How have meetings changed, how you facilitated them, or the ones you've been a part of? Paul?
They take a lot more energy, both in organizing and thinking about the format. But I think the lack of body language on a call like this, I think, makes it harder for the brain to process people's reactions and responses to things. And it just seems to be more exhausting, doesn't it? I think we've talked before about how spending the entire day working from home seems so much more tiring than working from the office. And it may well be a lot of cognitive scientists are now talking about, actually, it's because a lot of our communication is non-verbal, and our brains have evolved to deal with that non-verbal communication, and they find it easier. So that now, when all you can see is my head, you have to actually concentrate and listen more intently, and it's hard work. But you have to bear that in mind as a Scrum Master, or when you're involved in these meetings. Bear in mind that the cognitive load of online meetings all day is very high, and you have to try and do something incongruous to make it more interesting or fun, and make sure there's some breaks in there as well.
Yeah, I've been thinking about that side of it recently as well. We were talking within my teams about it being more difficult to judge emotion and stuff on calls, especially specifically when there's not many people that have got their cameras on, and it's a difficult one to balance, isn't it? Because at the same, there's a lot of nervousness that comes around having your face show up on a video to other people that I think we didn't have before in person. But also, I think partly it's more difficult for us as facilitators than it is necessarily for participators in calls, because it's very difficult, going back to what we were talking earlier about, to understand how a meeting's going if you can't see people's faces, you don't see waving hands. It's a lot more difficult. I've grown used to it, and I've gotten better at it, I think, over the last 18 months, but it still can be difficult.
What about you, John? What do you think?
Sorry, I was going to say, it's understanding the engagement in the meetings when it's virtual. As a facilitator, I struggle with, and why, when we've got meetings where there has to be, or I'd like there to be, communication between all of the team, I'll try to do it as a face-to-face if I can, because I think it's very easy, especially with certain Scrum events where, if you're in teams where they've been doing it for a while, and sometimes you lose that engagement with them because their understanding has waned a little bit of the purpose of the meetings. that it's really easy to multitask and not to really focus on the meeting if it's a virtual meeting, especially with no camera, or even with a camera. You know, someone's busy doing a load of stuff and they're drifting, they're not really engaged with the meetings. And I would say that's probably the biggest struggle from a facilitation role, in purely understanding that, you know, if you've not spoken for the last 5 minutes, does that mean you've drifted off, you're not there at all? Or is it, you know, you are? You know, it's a lot harder, I'd say. It makes them a lot easier in, especially our place, to have ad hoc ones, because, you know, you're not struggling for a month to book a meeting room in advance. But I find some of them a lot harder to judge if it's going well with everyone.
I guess one thing oh, sorry, Paul, carry on.
There's a great study from a German university a few years ago, I'll try and find the link to, that examined face-to-face communication with high-speed cameras. And one of the interesting things they found is that face-to-face conversations auto-correct every 90 seconds or so, just through little non-verbal movements or noises, sort of just acknowledgement noises. And it makes it much easier to clarify or challenge or correct if someone is misunderstanding. And we miss that online sometimes because of the way online calls work. It will prioritize the audio of the person who seems to be talking the most, so it makes it harder for other people just to make little acknowledgement noises, and it becomes less engaging, and you'll quite often see people drifting off, and it's obvious that they're actually doing a bit of coding on the other corner of their screen, and you've lost them slightly in that way, which is a shame.
One observation I've had over the last 12 months is that we're inviting more people to virtual meetings. Whereas before, if it was face-to-face, I might only call 2 people over, but, oh, it's virtual, why not I just invite the whole team? I know we sometimes do that psychologically as an inclusive thing, and I think that's great. But also there's a fine line between, are they actually purposeful? You know, some people, I once worked with someone who got quite defensive. Why am I not invited to that meeting? Well, with all due respect, you probably can't contribute. I see that as respectful by saying that, but they were viewing it the other side. There's a really great tool to use. It's called Welo. I'm not sure if it's available to us. In fact, I don't guess it probably isn't. But it's a really great way of having those organic face conversations. There's kind of like you have an avatar on a screen, and you can drag your avatar to certain places. It might be a ring of 8 seats. It might be a big lecture theatre. And when you're in that, you can only communicate with the people that are there. It's almost more conversational, and you could see if people are just sat on a place on their own, you can't interact with them, because and it's a great way of just showing people, hey, just leave me alone for 2 hours while I do this work. If I'm sat somewhere more communal, then hey, come and let's have a chat. And I love that tool. Great.
Interesting as well, Ryan. I was thinking about this earlier. There's almost a slight conflict in doing virtual meetings with people attempting to do better agile principles. So I think because people understand that transparency is a really good thing, I think by default, given the opportunity of doing virtual meetings, they'll invite the whole world to them, because they're thinking, well, everyone might be interested, they can come along if they like. And it's a very difficult thing to balance. I think it's a nice idea, but at the same time, it's probably a huge waste of time for a whole bunch of people,
especially if they aren't willing to do, as Paul said, to just leave if they, you know, if it's not valuable to them. Go to the place where you can add the most value.
I would say one of the things that it does, or it has helped with, I think, is the multiple conversations happening in a meeting room. You can't really do that virtually. Talking over each other doesn't happen. So it does, in that sense, kind of focus the direction of the communication that's going on. Because I've been in many meetings where you've got a large group of people to talk about a problem or something, and you'll have little pockets of conversation going, and that's, you know, it can be distraction. It obviously is a sign that someone's not engaging with what's going on. So I think, you know, they've definitely got their purpose, and you know, their strengths as well.
I suppose in an online meeting, you could have conversations going on in the background. They could be doing direct messaging or limited groups of chat in the background. But if they're doing that, then you've probably got a whole host of other problems to worry about as well.
Matt, perhaps you have one more comment, and then we might try to wrap up.
Yeah, sure. Sorry, I was just going to say, I think sort of along the lines of that, in that I found it quite useful to have moved away from some meetings and emails to more text chat. Text chat between large groups of people within teams has been really useful over the last few months. Whereas before, you try and get a couple of teams together in a room to talk about a problem. A lot of the time, nothing really came out of that. I think now, if you just get a bunch of people, you put them into a text chat that can go on for days if they like, then they're getting better solutions out of that than they would have normally. So I think that's helped.
I'm going to try that, a text meeting. Yeah, why not? We can all make a decision on 5 minutes where we want to go out to the pub in an evening on a WhatsApp.
Yeah, exactly.
But you put us in a meeting room, I guarantee it'll take 30. Brilliant. Well, thank you very much for joining today, gents. Hopefully for those people listening, you found it useful. What we've been talking about is what makes a good meeting, and actually focusing on the purpose that you're there, and making sure you have clear actions at the end of it. It might sound obvious, but sometimes a good meeting is actually made before the meeting itself. Thinking about the way in which we want to hold that, facilitate it, and then actually it's just the execution in the middle that hopefully will go okay. Well, like I said, thank you very much, gents, for listening. Anybody who is listening and has any questions, please do feel free to reach out to any of us if you have any questions about what we've spoken about, any resources. But yeah, thank you very much, gents.
Cheers.
Ryan.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Ryan.